the internet. So tonight, we're going to be hearings from some voices other than mine, and also inviting us to give some thought to how we learn history, particularly American history, but not limited to that. If you were like me, as you came through the school system, now this way in North Carolina, may be different other places. We had in fourth grade, we took North Carolina history, state history, and then in 11th grade, we took world civilization or Western civilization rather. And then somewhere around 8th or 9th grade, we delved into civics and U.S. history. So it may have varied some in your school experience, but I do want to harken back a little bit to that and think about what you were taught in your formal education, particularly prior to college, if you went to college or university. So we're going to ask that question tonight and sort of wrestle with that a little bit. Some of the videos we're going to watch from persons of color, not all of them are persons of color, some are Caucasian or white folks, but they're going to be pretty hard hitting. And I want us to remember that if we see anything that we really disagree with or really makes us uncomfortable, let's be patient with ourselves and also with this process and realize that part of what we're doing tonight is intentionally hearing from voices that we may not have heard that much from or haven't heard from them in a long time. So we want to make some space in our hearing and in our thinking to listen to the issues and the passion and the sometimes the anger and disappointment that is expressed in some of what you're going to hear. And that's fair. If we, as primarily white folks, who most of you, I'm guessing, grew up like I did, and there was a lot that we did not learn. And some of what we're going to hear tonight refers to things that maybe I never knew that happened, or gosh, I didn't know he or she felt that way. And that's good. That's good. That's part of our learning. Just to kick things off with regard to history, and maybe this will plant some seeds or spur some sparks in your mind about the way we learned about the history of our country, of our region, of our state, of the world. I asked the question, I have been asking for now over 20 years. Why was I 45 years old before I ever heard or saw or read anything about the Tulsa race riots of 1921 or the coup, the governmental coup that took place in Wilmington, North Carolina in 1898, 1899? Why was I so old, middle-aged, before I ever heard anything about the race riots back in the 20s in Detroit, Michigan? Most of that was not at all part of my formal schooling in learning history, particularly U.S. history. And so there's many, many things like that we need to learn. So in this course, tonight and in the next few weeks, we may refer to some of the formal learning that we had that was sort of standard. You know, George Washington chopping down the cherry tree and cannot tell a lie. Abraham Lincoln doing his studies with coal on the back of a shovel in his log cabin where he grew up. And many of the issues and facts that we have learned about history we may find are somewhat skewed, somewhat sanitized, somewhat, dare we use the word whitewashed. I realize that's packed full of meaning. But that's worth us noting and being mindful of that as we explore white Christian nationalism. So all of that is a precursor to this, to what we're going to be looking at tonight. So some of these videos are a little bit longer, maybe 4 or 5 minutes. Most of them are just 1 to 2 minutes long, and we'll have some conversation around that as we go. But I'm going to be thinking, I'll ask you to think about that because I want to come back to what did we learn and what did we not learn in our formal education about the history of our state, our region, and our nation. Very important question. So, um, I've got this fancy clicker and I hope that it works. There you go. These schedules are on your table, and that's just to help us sort of stay on track. Just reminding us of this working definition. This pulls from many different persons and writings and so forth. White Christian nationalism manipulates racial kinship, religious faith and language, and national identity and pride, often referred to as patriotism, to acquire political and social power. This is a working definition. Don't expect it to be complete now, but we'll continue to wrestle with that and kind of work on it. So tonight we're going to look at a little bit of background, history through the eyes of non-white persons, although some of the persons you'll see on the screen are white folks. Now, these videos, clips have varying degrees of clarity and sound and so forth. So you might have to, one or two of them might run a second time if you have a hard time hearing them. But be ready for that. And I believe they're coming through the speakers well. I tested it out this week, or rather earlier today. So this is a woman who is a wonderful scholar and sociologist, and has done a lot of lecturing over the last 30 years. She's appeared on Oprah Winfrey. She's appeared on all sorts of mass media, and as well as more scholarly journals and periodicals. And she writes a lot about race in America. So I want you to hear this. Just a quick one. Can we run that again? Did you hear it okay? Okay, good. Anyway, so her point is that, and this is, I think, an important point for us to keep in mind when it comes to understanding white Christian nationalism, is that long before any folks of European heritage found their way here to what we now call America, there were people already living here. And her point is that prior to what we call indigenous people or First Nations or Native Americans, there were cultures and peoples that predated them. A lot of her research and many other folks goes to show that we all come from African ancestors, or at least folks who originated and evolved on the continent of Africa. And that's one reason the Egyptian empire is so old. The dynasties go back so far. There in China seem to be the oldest organized civilizations on Earth or in history. And so her point is that, and I'll put it more bluntly than she did in that video, you don't discover a place where people are already living. Okay? You have to concoct a story. And in fact, way back in the 15th century, the Pope at the time helped with that dilemma and actually made a pronouncement. And some of you here who've been through courses and classes, you know the name for that. Bob or Carol, can you help me with that term? The Pope's encyclical at the time had to do with folks who were explorers from Europe. I want to say Terra. Anyway, I can't remember the Latin. Can anybody know the term? Say again. No, that's close, but it was his pronouncement to the empires and kingdoms of Europe, particularly Spain and France and Italy, saying that any new lands that they discovered could be claimed for that country or that empire or that kingdom. And so the Pope was giving his firm approval and affirmation to the whole beginnings of what they call discovery, colonization, dominance of European people over indigenous peoples all over South America, North America, and anywhere else that they happen to go and see. And so that part of that history, that nourished notions that came along later, not just in the United States, but in other places, that we call terms like manifest destiny. Isn't that a whopper of a term? And in America, we use that term to justify moving across the continent all the way from the Atlantic to the Pacific Ocean and justifying whatever it is we decided to do to the people, the human beings who were already there and were quote unquote in the way. So we just, manifest destiny was a powerful motivation. And you had horrors like the Trail of Tears, reservations, outright warfare and slaughter, and so forth. It's rare that tables were ever turned, but Custer found that out, didn't he? But that was a blip on the screen. Bob, you had a comment?
No, I was just going to tell you, I just looked up. It's called Inter Caetera.
There you go, Inter Caetera, and that's the Pope's affirmation back in the 15th, 16th century that European explorers could take over, could claim any lands that they discovered in the Western Hemisphere. So the roots of that go back at least that far. That whole notion that if you're strong enough and have the technology and the means to overwhelm your neighbors or other nations or cultures, then you can do so and claim God's affirmation and God's blessing and approval. So interesting notion. Can you discover a place where people are already living? A good question. I'll just kind of let that hang in the air for just a little bit. All right. This is a longer video by a professor named Tim Wise. And it's part of a lecture that he gave exploring a little bit of history, particularly as as America was being settled by Europeans, and what motivated folk, and that whole notion of whiteness. We'll come back to this video in a week or two, but that whole notion of what it means to be white, what it means to be non-white, and gives us a good perspective on a little bit of that.
We have this increasing problem. I don't need one that Donald Trump defines as a problem, but others define as a problem on the far right, actually are the border. I'm talking about the reason we have a narrative problem. The reason we have such vitriol aimed at folks coming across the border. But keep in mind, only one border. The Minutemen do not camp out in boats off the coast of Nova Scotia, shooting at those crafty Canadians as they sneak into our country to take advantage of our superior health care. They don't do that. It's just down there at that other border, which I beg to remind you is an artificial border created at the outcome of a war, which was a war of aggression started on false pretense by this country. Not what they taught us in the 8th grade, but now that is what happened. So really, folks are coming home. Can I get an amen? People are coming home. They're coming home. They're coming home. And their families were here a long time before the vast majority of ours, and yet we tell them that they don't belong. Very interesting. The reason this is even possible, though, is because of the narrative we told about how we, and now I'm talking about those of us with European descent, Black folks know how they got here. A lot of Asian folk know how they got here. A lot of folks were brought over, particularly Chinese folk, to work the railroads, didn't care how many of them died, right? Indigenous folks know how they got here, right? White folks told a fiction. White folks' story is basically been this: our came for liberty and freedom. We came for principles like that. Those people are just coming for stuff. Right? That's what we say in so many words. We came for principles, they're coming for stuff. Let's clear this up. We did not come for liberty and freedom. And I know this because if we had come for liberty and freedom, we would have established liberty and freedom. And I don't just mean with regard to people of color, I mean each other. Like, white folks spent a lot of time in the colonies just trying to figure out who was the bigger witch. right? Like we just would kill each other. Well, it wasn't like one big happy white family. It was just, you're not a good enough Christian. No, you're not a good enough Christian. No, you're not a good enough Christian. Now I'm going to drown you because you're a warlock. I mean, that was the kind of, like, in a nutshell, that was the colonial experience. So that was not Schoolhouse Rock, right? Yeah, right? So we didn't establish liberty and freedom even vis-a-vis one another. Let's be honest, we came for stuff. We came for stuff like opportunity, stuff like land, stuff like the ability to survive because things weren't working back home. Like, we can be honest about, like, our people were the losers of Europe. And I don't mean that, I'm not trying to be judgmental or harsh. I'm just being honest. Like, when Donald Trump says Mexico's not sending their best. Okay, you think anyone sent their best? Like, not like that. Look, the people say, my family came over on the Mayflower. All right, shh. What are you bragging, but that is not. I don't know who was on the Mayflower, but I know who wasn't. The king. The king was not on the Mayflower. Nobody the king wanted to keep around was on the Mayflower. But we have this fictional narrative. It's almost like we believe sometime around 1642, there was a British father somewhere in England that got his family together around the fireplace in the morning and said, all right, here's the thing. I know we're doing pretty well. We have this big castle with all this gold. I know it's brilliant. It's fantastic. We were at the King's Palace last week. Kids, you remember you played with these children out in the garden? Wasn't that great? Yeah. I know it was amazing, wasn't it? It was great. Listen, that's all fine and good, but Dad has an idea. My idea is as follows. Keep up, please. Keep up. Gather all your things. Not all of your things. We have a lot of things because we're doing really well. We're rich. We're powerful. Just gather up like a basket full of stuff. We are going to get a boat. And by that, I mean a rickety old ship. Like, I don't even know if it's seaworthy. Like, it might sink. We might drown, get eaten by sharks, get robbed by pirates, get scurvy, die a horrible, miserable death on the open ocean. However, and this is the important part, it will be an adventure. So what do you say? That didn't happen. Right? The winners didn't get on the boats. The winners had no reason to leave. And you know what? There's no shame in it. There's no shame at all having been losers. In fact, let me tell you something. There's something quite beautiful about the loser saying, we're done with losing and we're going to rebel against that and try to carve out a new life. But you know what? It's every bit as beautiful when folks in Mexico do it, and Guatemala do it, and Sri Lanka do it, and Vietnam do it, and Nigeria do it. And did any of us actually believe that if our family's countries of origin had been contiguous to the United States, that they wouldn't have come undocumented? Like, do we think my great-grandfather, who came as a Jewish immigrant from Russia in the early 1900s, like if Russia had been where Mexico is, do we actually want to believe that he would have said, well, I would love to be able to feed my family and keep them from dying, but there are these laws? No, he would have done what he had to do. So this whole thing about documented and undocumented is this artificial narrative too. First of all, who's documented and who's not is the result of laws passed by people in power. It has nothing to do with inherent morality and ethics. It has to do with power, straight power relationships. And any of our families would have done the same thing to keep our families alive, right? But if we're not willing to critique that narrative, we can't see ourselves in them. We can't see them and us, and they and we. Once again, what we get to this grammar thing, but either one will work.
Well, a whole lot to unpack there. Let's talk about it. Earlier in the video, he made the point is that the folks who came to settle America from Europe were coming for stuff, not liberty and freedom, though that was sort of packaged in there. But they were looking for a way just to get a better life for themselves and their families. So what do we make of that, particularly in the history we were taught in school about, the Mayflower? And I got a quick family anecdote about that. My mother, her maiden name was Powell. We named her son after her. She was so proud that she had done the genealogy and had figured out that our family through the Powells was related to William Brewster, who was on the Mayflower. And so she made me and my sisters, all to my eternal concern, lifetime members of the Mayflower Society. So there you go. I've never gone to a meeting. I've never had anything to do with it. They keep writing me, wanting money, and want me to attend, and so forth. My dad, who was, of course, the Latimer side of the family, he kind of caught that bug, and so he began to explore his genealogy. He got back to his mother's grandmother, his great grandmother and father on the Latimer side, and got all the way back to Texas and some folks named Johnson. And it turns out that one of them, at the time, this is the way Dad put it, one of them was a half breed, had some Cherokee Indian, about half Cherokee Indian in them. Another one had been hung because of horse thieving. And so all of a sudden, all those papers Dad was working on genealogy, they just disappeared. And we didn't talk about any of that anymore. Oh, you know, on your mother's side, the Mayflower. On my side, well, we just won't talk about it. So history is often a matter of what we pay attention to. So that statement he made that folks came here for stuff, for the ability to build a new life, because they were kind of losers in Europe, and they came here for that reason. What do you make of that compared to what you were taught in school? Anybody want to share a comment about that?
That the people came from because of religious persecution.
Yep, I was taught the same thing. Religious persecution. And that ties into the freedom to worship and to hold to faith in God the way we feel our conscience leads us to do, not because the king or the church or somebody tells us they have to do that. That runs deep in the heart of American ethos and psyche. That sense of freedom. Yeah. Other comparisons to what you learned in school about the reasons that folks came to America. Yes.
Just jumping on that. So the religious freedom, the Puritans didn't want anyone else to be anything other than Puritan. So that's why they came here. And if you ever heard anything about the witch trials in Salem started by the Puritans, that's what that was you need to be like us. So it's not, we want to go live in peace, it's we want everyone else to believe exactly what we do. And if they don't, then they're in trouble.
Yep. Sure, Carol.
Economic opportunity, like Irish,
Economic opportunity.
my relatives came on my father's side because of the potato famine in Ireland. So their families were split up and all over the world, because nobody, the oldest son would inherit the property. And they had a lot of children back then. And so it was just, that was the reason. To be able to eat.
Yep. Good. Susan, you had a comment?
Well, let's don't swing too far the other way. It was very nuanced, and my ancestors were Roger Williams, who can thank for the separation of church and state. The first 12 homes, lots settled, 5 of those were my ancestors. And I also had ancestors in Plymouth Colony, and my ancestors were very independently minded, so they got kicked out of Massachusetts colony and went to New Haven colony, got kicked out of there and went, and so they went several places, but they were persecuted. They could not practice their religion. So let's don't think the king was, some wise person, because we really owe our freedom to that spirit. And my ancestors didn't have a lot of money at all, but
Gotcha.
yeah.
Thank you. Other reflections on what we learned in school about why folks came to America. Yes, Jimmy. Being unfairly taxed, no taxation without representation. Well, I heard that over and over and over in my history class. The whole Boston Tea Party thing and yeah, so there needs to be a connection between the conditions of my government and me. In other words, the government doesn't need to be a king or a prince or a remote sort of thing that just does their will against, my wishes. And so that whole notion that I have a say, I have a voice in how life's going to go for me and my fellow citizens, very important. Yeah, Ted, you were going to comment?
Yeah, well, I learned more from my family than anything. I also had a relative come over on Mayflower, Richard Warren, and it was my maternal side of the family, and she said it was because of religious persecution. My father's side of the family, Deacon Samuel Chapin, is one of the founders of Springfield, Massachusetts, and there's actually a statue of him that says Puritan on it. And it was the same thing. I learned more from my family, but I'm a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant man, and it wasn't until I was older that I realized I lost a lot of pride in all that. I had a grandmother, great-grandmother, great-grandfather that owned slaves and all that. And as I got older and was more involved in the civil rights movement, it became apparent to me that I was being whitewashed by my family. And I'm proud of my family, don't get me wrong, but the narrative was very, very skewed.
Sure. Karen?
Thinking back about high school and junior high and history lessons, I always thought if the Puritans came for freedom, the Jamestown crowd came for stuff. They sent over a lot of gentlemen. If you go to Jamestown and look at the monument there, the occupations are listed. There were some coopers and farmers and whatnot, but there were a whole bunch that were listed as gentlemen. So they were just planning on picking up the riches. And then the state of Georgia, we were often told, was settled with prisoners. That the English needed to empty out their jails, they just didn't know what to do with all their debtor prisons particularly. And both Australia and the US received many people from the prison system.
Kind of a good deal. You can get some clemency and if you're willing to pick up and go to a new place and never come back, it's one way to deal with your criminals, right? Just send them somewhere else. Yeah. Michael, and then we'll move on.
In junior high, I had this phenomenal history teacher, 8th grade, and he said we were England's cash cow before the revolution. They purposely pushed tradesmen and everything they could, people that could actually work, to come here so they could use them to do all their product making for nothing.
Interesting thought. Let's move on. We got some others to look at and we'll have some response to those as well.
We have this immigration problem and
All right, we're gonna jump a little ahead now into some more recent American history, and particularly with regard to racial tensions and issues.
After the Civil War in 1865, Union General William T. Sherman issued Special Field Order Number 15, promising free African American families 40 acres of land, and in some cases, a moon, to help them rebuild their lives. This was meant to provide economic independence to formerly enslaved people. However, after President Andrew Johnson took office, the order was revoked, and most of the land was returned to the former Confederacy. This broken promise left many African Americans struggling for economic stability, shaping racial inequality that persisted for generations. After the Civil
All right, I want to pair that short clip with a slightly longer one of Dr. Martin Luther King reflecting on history of, he calls them Negroes in the language of the mid-60s. Black folks in America from this time following during the time of Reconstruction further on into later years.
America refused to give the Negro any land. Through an act of Congress, our government was giving away millions of acres of land in the West and the Midwest, which meant that it was willing to undergird its white peasants here with an economic floor. But not only did they give the land, they built land grant colleges, government money to teach them how to farm. Not only that, they provided county agents further their expertise in farming. Not only that, they provided low interest rates in order that they could mechanize their farm. Not only that, today many of these people are receiving millions of dollars in federal subsidies not to farm, and they are the very people telling the black man if he ought to lift himself on his own bootstraps. We are coming to get our check.
So you wonder why they shot him. We tend to even try to sanitize Dr. King and other voices and say, "Oh, that speech, at the Washington or Lincoln Memorial back in 1963 was so moving, Nobel Prize winning." But Dr. King understood and analyzed and saw the deep economic inequities and the poverty that was in great measure, not totally, there's no such thing as total, but in great measure due to systemic racism. That is, decisions made at the level of governments in state and federal that excluded some folks and included others. And you just gave a great example. A great many European folk, white folk, settled in the Midwest and Western states and were assisted in all those ways. And Black folks were excluded from that. Just like, for the most part, Black folks were excluded from the GI Bill following World War II. And so we talk about, racism as if it's just an individual thing. There are bad people who are racist, and then there are not so bad people who are not so racist. But it's baked in. It's baked into our history in many, many ways. So let me invite you to respond to these two videos, perspectives of persons of color, and how they view history, how they view the American experience. Anybody want to comment on either of these two videos? Is this new for us, or have we heard this before? Yes.
Because everything worked. I wasn't looking around, just listening. And that's what I think most of us did. If it worked, it didn't bother us. And I guess in the last 10 years I was sitting at this table, it is so wonderful to me that people we have never heard of, at least are writing and telling the truth about others. It's hard in your environment to really know them, to really, for us to trust each other to talk. But the books that are written and the stories that are told have certainly been enlightening to me.
Yep. Other comments?
I would say that, and I think coming from those values that did come from the Puritans or passed on the generations. I grew up in the South drinking from black water fountains, and my father thought that was just fine.
Yep. Yes, Martha.
I was. So but we came back to visit every summer to my grandmother. And it was a surprise to me to come back and to go to the movie on Saturday matinee and to find out that it was segregated. The blacks had to enter on the outside, go up the stairs and stand in the balcony. And those of us who were white, we sat on the first floor. Now in Iowa, where I grew up, all those kids let us sit in the balcony. And all of a sudden I wasn't allowed to sit in the balcony. You know, it was just a whole different world.
Hold the mic off the table.
Okay, it was just a different world to come here in the summer and go back to Iowa. And, you know, one of the schools I went to, the student body president was black, you know.
Sure.
So it was, you know, it's just the way it was. So it was really a surprise in the summer.
Bob. Right here. Bob. This Bob.
It's all the way up front.
You volunteered for this job.
Also, thank you. As we look at this things that's happened in the 1960s, but then before that, you know, you can look forward a little bit. And you get the comment a lot, well, that happened back in the 60s, even we're not like this anymore. And I have to remember that there's things like, you know, we know what generational wealth is. We also know that there's a thing that's like there's generational poverty too. We usually, not always, but people who have money, their children end up having money, education, and so forth. These people back in the 60s were in some that didn't get the GI Bill, and some of them that had all their land taken away from them. Those people have passed down generational poverty. And the people and their ancestors or their descendants are suffering because of that.
Yeah. Merritt had a comment too. Yeah, Liz.
I grew up in Jacksonville, Florida. I grew up during the Great riots. We had to ride buses through all top hot testing during this kids. And we did study about the movement. We did still study about Tulsa because they wanted us to understand why people were so angry and how we could be part of the solution. So I'm sorry that my children grew up in North Carolina and it was whitewashed. But I did study. Another stuff. I went to Campbell University.
Say again.
I went to
Campbell. Okay.
Two of our players were African American. This is one they want to play with. African Americans, because they don't ever see any blacks, is what they ever heard. And so my point to you is, I don't know what all the truth is, but if you open your eyes and your ears and your heart, you'll see what's going on. And if someone wants to try to whitewash it, then you should be asking, why are you trying to erase reality? So shame on us for allowing other people or using the excuse of I didn't see it or I didn't know it or you let it happen. It's happening right now. It's still happening.
Yep. Just to marry to that comment, it's so important when it comes to history to pay attention to who we listen to. Pay attention, all of us, to who we listen to. I could get off on understanding scripture that way, but that's a whole other course. Paying attention to who we listen to and why. Barbara, you had a comment.
Sure, and I would also say know your sources. I mean, TikTok, quite honestly, is not where I would go to for history either. I mean, you have to be really careful what you see with that. I like Merritt had kind of a different perspective too. I grew up in Durham, and I was the first class that was integrated at Durham City schools. So I was always the minority. We had 7 white kids in my senior class in high school. And so I had a different perspective. But what I saw growing up was a very different Black culture than what
what was portrayed, I saw extremely successful African-American families. There was one of the first Black-owned insurance companies, National, out of Durham. And so I went to school with kids that were driving BMWs, and, my family was poor white trash. So, I mean, there was such, and I sort of I saw what it was like to be a minority, but there's no way you could ever see what it was like to be Black in the 70s and 80s. And I kind of thought that was going to be better, but now I think it's harder than ever on our African-American friends, and it's terrifying.
Yeah, it is for sure. Before you, Denise, Barbie, tell us again, you grew up where?
Durham.
Durham, North Carolina. Denise?
Another experience, I grew up in southeastern part of North Carolina, very rural, very country, part of Bladen County, Elizabethtown, White Lake, Tar Heel. That's where I grew up in the 70s and the 80s. My grandparents had a tobacco farm. I worked at a tobacco farm. My mother did. And we'd get in the back of the pickup truck and we would go pick up. And lots of times it was African Americans that would work with us because none of the white people wanted to do that job, but his family. And so that's what I grew up doing. And then the high school that I went to, I was only 75% Black. So I was the minority in that. And we all got along. There were some that went on to college and did really well. There were some that went into the military. There were some that, stayed in poverty. But I saw that with the white and the Black, where we all just tried to get along and respect each other. But I agree with Barbie. I think it's gotten worse. I think that we're separating more so than we were then. We're working from our homes. We're teaching from our homes. We're not getting around and being around people of different colors and cultures, and we're in our little groups. And I think it's just only going to get worse.
Yep. A lot of what white Christian nationalists are doing today is connected to some of the history and perspective we're talking about right now. Michael, I want to save your comment because I do want to move on. I'm watching the clock. And Barbie, good point. We got to be real careful with TikTok. And I'll only apologize to say, in the limited time that I had to pull these together and give us some clips of people that I do trust, that was the best source I could turn to. So shame on me. It's not very scholarly, and I agree with that. So we'll just be careful. This is Dr. William Barber. Some of you may know him. He's a North Carolina pastor. He's been very involved in the Poor People's Campaign. He's been very involved in legislative matters, community organizing, particularly in the Durham, Chapel Hill, Raleigh area. And he gives an interesting reflection on a little more of our history coming from Reconstruction on into the early 20th century.
In 1996, you had Plessy versus Ferguson. 1883, you had the overturning of the 1875 Civil Rights Act push to recodify and institute fully white supremacy, white nationalism into the law. Wilmington was a powerful city. It was 50% African American. The wealthiest man in North Carolina was African American in Wilmington, and Wilmington would have ended up being Atlanta, that kind of city. It was targeted. If we could shut it down, but white supremacists got together, and on November 10th, they brought a Gatling gun into Wilmington. They burned down the Black newspaper, and they went on a killing spree. And it was endorsed by churches. Some preachers stood in their pulpit and said, we have to fill the Gates Agreement with the blood of the, I won't say the word, let it be so that we can return the government to its right ownership of the white man. But after that riot, they sent telegrams all over the country saying, this is how you return power. It took 90 years for North Carolina to have another Black person in city council. Voting went to almost zero in the Black community. Charles P. Aycock becomes governor, but you know what he did? He went to whites and said, if you don't want your children to be like these Black children, because we're going to make it so you have to have a certain educational level to vote, you better let me raise taxes on your property. So he used a race eye to get whites who were racist in North Carolina to allow him to raise taxes off their property to build public school.
What was the white man better? That's the colored man. He's both notice his pocket. Hell, giving somebody look down on and empty his pockets for you.
Hey. That last comment was someone quoting Lyndon Johnson from the 1950s when he was running for office down in Texas, just commenting on how to get votes and how to persuade people. And that whole systemic attempt to separate, divide, and conquer. If you can convince the lowest white man that, and he use the term man, the lowest white man that he's better than the highest black man, you know, you can pick his pocket. In fact, he'll pick his pocket for you and hand his money over to you if you're willing to promote them. So Dr. Barber just reflects some on some North Carolina history and some of the persons involved in those days, from 1900 till about the 1920s. Yeah, that was the Wilmington coup and race riots of 1899, 1900, right in that. Yeah. Yep. In Wilmington, North Carolina. Yeah. So reflections further on what you heard there. Anybody? Was that new for some of you to hear about some of the racial tensions and situations in North Carolina at that time? Certainly North Carolina wasn't the only place, but that's what was going on in our state.
We had our Sunday school class where the values, we read a very good history of that. The richest man spoke of, black man that spoke of in that video was the son, I think it was Governor Manley. It was one of the governors. I believe it was Governor Manley. He could not be recognized by people who knew. So it was very complicated. Of course, Governor Manley was a white man.
Sure. And you know, this harkens back, come right to you. This harkens back to that notion that people in power, and in the case of the American South and in North Carolina, during certain periods, it was white folks who were bound and determined to hang on to political and social power. And one of the ways they did that was by saying, it all belongs to us. People of color, and frankly, men compared to women, we should be in charge. We should make decisions. We should control the wealth and the decision making, and not allow anybody else to be above us or even equal to us. Yes.
Well, I know some comments about what going up in the 70s and 80s, but if you grew up in the 50s and 60s, really were before integration happened. I remember the overriding absolute thing with politics and everybody's discussion about any time there was an election. Will they integrate schools? Will they keep them separate? That was a big thing. And I can remember segregation. I can remember standing in line on one side of the whatever student here for the white people to go in, and the other side for the white people student. I mean, there was not a way to get together. We were kept apart. And that did end after the Terry Sanford, the Kennedy administration. I mean, a lot of things didn't change, but if you really go back a little bit, it was totally separated from it. And they were terribly scared of integration there. It was just like that was just the worst thing that ever could happen to you and family. You know? But anyway, that's just
Yep. The Klan made a lot of hay out of race mixing. You know, we don't want that. Can't have that. You'll water down white folks if they mix with other races. It's an interesting notion, based in no facts whatsoever, but powerful motivator for some folks. Okay, let me move on. All right, this is Dr. King again, reflecting on opportunities for Black folk in his experience growing up in the 40s and 50s and beginning his ministry and work in the late 50s on and through the 60s.
Does the Negro in America know what he wants to be?
I'm convinced that almost every Negro in this country, other than those who have been so scarred in the system that they've become pathological in the process, we all have to battle with pathology. Everybody really knows what it means to be a Negro unless one can really experience. And I know we all have to battle with this constant dream, feeling of nobody's. But in spite of this, I think the syndrome of deprivation surrounding conditions, whether it's in housing, in the economic area, in schools, and the vicious credit practices that we face in the ghetto and constant defeats. But in spite of all this, I think we all basically we want to be man, we want to be persons, just not on the basis of the color of our skin, but on the basis of the content of our character.
You know that many young Negroes don't want anything that smacks of the American white middle class. But they want something that smacks of whatever is the Black middle class, or they just not want bourgeois values, which after all the basis of this democracy.
I think we have to see what they are saying. I would be the first to agree that integration does not mean giving up everything that has an Afro-American teeth, so to speak. Background. I think there are certain unique things within any culture and certain cultural elements. And when you get to the process of validation, really the whole to me, integration is best. It is opportunity to participate in the beauty of controversy. I think the other thing that I see is that these young people are saying that there must be a revolution back in our country. Gender violence, they don't want to do what the faculties is there needed to bring it to the party. And I feel that it's needed for a revolution. Because some of the families that basically certainly not aligned with the families and behind this structure of structure intention. Integration. The patients of the evils, it's not the racism, exploitation of it. Sins and the burial sins, these three are tied inextricably together. We are not one that.
Does the Negro in America
Not call you Zora.
We'll come back to that in just a moment. So Dr. King in that clip is going deeper. This was closer to the end of his life, and he was beginning to see that racism and even systemic racism is deeply tied into some other issues, and he mentioned two of them there. Economic opportunity and the poverty that comes from lack of opportunity. And militarism. He was very critical of the amount of money that our nation was spending and all the nations of the earth were spending on war and weapons and munitions and all the things that go under the guise of national defense. And so he was seeing, trying to go deeper in his analysis and understanding. This is why he got tainted to be a radical. This is why the FBI and the CIA were bugging his room and watching him and trying to infiltrate the civil rights movement, because he was saying things that were really hard for particularly white folks to hear and powerful people to hear. And it cost him dearly, as we know. One of his famous sayings was, "It is a cruel jest to tell a bootless man to pull himself up by his own bootstraps." A lot of truth in that. I think that, I'll just leave it at that. What do you think about this deeper analysis of seeing how the relationships between various systems and realities in we'll just say in American culture? Is that still going on today? And how has it changed from Dr. King's time? What do you think about that? Anybody? Carol?
Well, I think it's still going on today, but it's really hard to change these things because it just takes so much effort. Things are already established in place. The property is already divided up. It's just very difficult for us to make reparations, but it's definitely needed.
Yeah, at the end of not that clip, but the earlier one of Dr. King, he said, "We're coming to get our check." And that whole notion of reparations goes back a long way. This is not just, people didn't just come up with this in the last 25 or 30 years. There have been discussions around reparations for the descendants of African slaves in America for a long, long, long time. And every decade that goes by, the amount of money that will be involved just exponentially increases and increases. So probably unlikely that will ever happen. But it kind of begs the question, how do we make it right? How do we change? How do we engage in this revolution of values? And that's why he was trying to go deeper in this particular clip and with many of his writings and his speeches and leadership. So yes, Margaret.
I think he did. Point. He said that we made people feel like they were nobody. We made people feel like they were nobody. And no Christian in this world should call themselves Christian and make people feel like they're nobody. Nobody. Speaking barely, of the time that he was alive, of course, and it's still the same true today. I mean, that's what we're doing to our any person of color, our folk who are coming across the southern border, and our Black friends in this country. We're doing the very same thing to all of them.
I've got a colleague who's, you can go ahead and get to the next person. Is it Michael or Denise? Michael, and then we'll go to Denise. I've got a good friend who's a mom and a United Methodist pastor, and she and her husband live in Greensboro. They've got now a little 11-year-old girl, and when Olivia was just about 4 or 5 years old, she was just moving into kindergarten from preschool. And in her kindergarten class, my friend her mother noticed that there was a little, in her playgroup, there was a Black girl. I think there was also maybe a couple of Hispanic kids and an Asian girl or boy, and everybody else was white. And she picked her up from preschool one day and said, how was your day? What happened today? And she said, well, one little girl fell down and got hurt and said a bad word. And the teacher scolded her, but got her, picked her up and helped clean up the, skinned her knee and so forth. And my friend knew from talking to the teacher that was the little black girl. And so she said, well, to her daughter, who was it that fell and said a bad word? Thinking that her daughter would probably notice that it was, a black girl. And she said, oh, it was the girl wearing the red dress. The girl wearing the red dress. Didn't really notice. It didn't matter whether she noticed or not. It didn't matter to her that girl was black and somebody else was white. Now, that's such a tiny little thing. You could even think it insignificant. But is it? What are we teaching? Not only what are we listening to when we understand our sense of history and who we are as a nation and as a world, and as a people, but then what are we teaching those who are coming along? Merritt, you alluded to it, and knowing that your experience was what it was and you lived it, you can now teach your boys, right? Your children, what they may not be getting in school. Michael?
I went in the Navy in 1959. I went to boot camp in San Diego, California in the winter. The company I was put in had 15 black sailors. I'd never been around 15 blacks in my life. When I left boot camp, I honestly had no idea that I would like them as well as I did. They were the best guys I ever served. In 15 and a half years of active duty, boot camp took all of our inhibitions and our problems or anything that might have come up. Well, that was 1959. My first staff duty before I left for Vietnam, we had 4 blacks on the staff, and they were constantly harassed by the white officers. They were never good enough, never did anything good enough. That was Jacksonville, Florida. And that whole base was run with that ideology. 1964.
Yeah, Deneen, I think, wanted to make a comment. Deneen, yeah, we'll get to.
I just wanted to talk about the present. We're talking about the past, and it's good to reflect on that. Our oldest son is engaged to a beautiful Asian Vietnamese young lady, and they live in Beverly Hills. She can't walk her dog without somebody yelling out like racial slurs to her about being in that neighborhood and walking the dog. So
You mean Beverly Hills, California?
Beverly Hills,
Oh, here. Okay.
Beverly Hills, right down the
In our
road.
community.
Yes. Yes, in the beautiful Beverly Hills, people will ride by, see her walking her dog and say a racial slur. What is she doing in that neighborhood?
Mm.
So that may not be your child or your neighbor, but when you hear that, let them know that is not appropriate. And I think as, when I go out, when I see someone, whether it's a server, somebody at Harris Teeter, I engage with them. I speak to them. I see them as a human being, ask them how their day is going. That makes them human. If we just walk around looking at people and only engaging and talking to people like us of color, we're never going to know what we have in common. And I think, one of the best pieces of advice is look for God in other people and let them see God in you.
Amen. Absolutely. Nancy?
I just want to speak to what you said earlier about the children.
Yeah. Here it comes.
I want to speak to what you said earlier about the children. I think that we teach them because I taught preschool for 20 years and children, we were close to FSU, so there was a lot of international students there. So we had all types of nationalities. We had white children, whatever, wherever they happen to come from to do the national studies there. But
the children did not recognize, I mean, they recognized differences, but only as being a different color or speaking a different language or something like that. They didn't do anything related to, oh, I'm this, so I'm better than you, because they all come from the same background. They were collegiates. And that was just what they were. So I think that we as adults teach children racism.
Yes.
You know, combining your comment and Deneen's, our kids will learn from us whether we teach them or not. And some of you have more experience with more children. I've got one, but my soon-to-be 37-year-old son, when we reflect on his childhood and things he says that I did or said, I'm like, who was that? I wasn't there for that. But that's how he perceived it. That's what he learned. And they'll learn from us by how we spend our money, what choices we make according to what values we're reflecting. And they'll pick that up whether we teach them or not.
Right, I'm gonna jump in before I hand off the mic
Okay.
as the children's minister in the room. I've got 10 years of children and teen ministry under my belt, and I can fully say that racism is taught to kids. They don't get it. They don't see other people that way. They just see, is that person my friend because they're nice to me, or are they not my friend because they're mean to me? That's what's going on in their head. They are wrapped in this innocence. So it's up to us to protect that, you know, and I've also been a co-director of a preschool before. I guess since we don't miss to talk. And I've had kids run up to me one day, a little black girl and a little white girl who were wearing a very similar rainbow sparkly colored jacket. They're like, we're twins today. Like that's what they think. Like that's, so when you have a kid who starts saying something mean to others based on race, that's coming from their parents. That's coming from something else. That is something that is drilled into them. And then on that, so we were talking about with what do we do today? How do we undo these systems? If you are in a place of power in the government, there's so much that you feel like your hands are tied, but it's not. Change starts within us. Like it's our job to go out and call out people who are spreading this hatred and stopping them, right? It's our job to educate one another and to, like Deneen was saying, to say, you need to stop. I'm not gonna let that happen. Like, I'm not gonna let you say those things. Even if it's just you and another person in a room by yourself and they start saying something, you know, against a minority, even though that minority isn't in the room with you, you are in that room. You can say something. You can stand up and end that. Say, this stops now. And they'll think next time before they do anything. And it is something that still happens today. I worked in a church in Roanoke, Virginia, which if you've ever read the book, Color of Law, there is still redlining going on today. And you can see it clear as day. And I had to teach my teenagers, my seniors, it's in your community. You're about to go into the world. You need to know what you're walking into. Like this, like at some point, you have to bring them out of that innocence and say, you need to stand up for one another. That's what we're called to do as Christians.
Thanks, Liz. Liz, you got to slip out? Okay. Huh? What? Okay. Bart?
You know, the other thing too, I had a great conversation a few years ago. I do a lot of public policy, and something that I hear a lot is I don't see color. And I've spoken with friends of mine that are Hispanic, Indian, African American, and he said that is just like saying I'm a racist because it does not recognize my history. It does not recognize the struggles that I've been through. And so that is something about calling out. That is something every one of us can say when someone says that, because you hear it quite a lot, particularly politically. And it's just as bad to say that.
It is, and it's just a lie. I'm lying to you if I say I don't see color. Of course I see color. In fact, the people of color that I know are proud of their heritage and their culture. And they want me to affirm them and say, I think it's cool that you are who you are, and I am who I am, and we got a lot in common, but I affirm the differences as well. Sure.
Equality is not the same. I don't want to be you.
Mhm.
I just want to be free people. I mean, that's what I got
Yep.
to do what I can do.
Let me show one more clip because we've been focusing on black-white racial issues. And just to keep before us that other big piece of American history that we don't really teach or want to talk about. See that? When the wall should have been built. All the white settlers, all of the Native Americans. Love it. Yeah, this is no longer Custer County, but some Native American folks claiming it for their nation. Yeah, so another aspect that we have to keep in mind of what we were taught and not taught about our history. And that is all the people who were here, the First Nations they're called, who were here before any of our ancestors got here from Europe or wherever they came from. And where did they all go? Where did all the Native Americans go? Well, that's a very dark and grim answer. We know where they went. They are no more. And the ones that lived, survived, were shoved onto reservations, and their land was taken away, their resources were taken away, their health was taken away. And many of them, were turned into shells of human beings, alcoholics, and on and on and on we could go. So real tragedy there. Yes. Yeah. Sure. Yeah. Our efforts to enslave Native American folk fell through because they knew where to go. They could live off the land, go up to the hills. White folks who enslaved them. So I'm going to invite maybe two last comments from anybody, and then we're at the point where we need to wrap up. Does anybody have a comment on the whole fullness of what we've looked at tonight? I know I've thrown a lot of stuff at you to think about and to consider. But with regard to our view of history, what we learned, what we didn't learn as we grew up and since that time. Anybody got a final reflection, Michael?
I have black friends.
Well, good for you.
I have black friends when
Yeah.
they're defending their position.
Yeah.
I know a couple of blacks.
Some of my best friends are black.
Yeah.
Yeah, right. Heard that phrase before. Any other comments? All right. Well, let's knock off for tonight. This was a wonderful conversation. As I say, I've thrown a lot at you. You'll see by your schedule where we're going to go next week. And we'll try to stick to that as much as we can. Yes, there will be some more TikToks that we'll be looking at, but we'll try to take them in context and try to get underneath and behind who's speaking and why. And maybe we'll learn a few more things. So have a great evening. Peace be with you, and thanks for coming tonight.